Hey, Iowa Realtors, Travis Bouchaw, your 2025 Iowa Realtors State President, here with Legal Counsel Justin Hayes, and 'tis the season. We're here to talk about stigmatized conditions. So, interesting stuff here. We were just having kind of a pre-conversation about what this entails, how the courts have handled it in some cases, and so tell us a little bit, in the eyes of the law, what is a stigmatized condition when it comes to a property?
Sure. So the first thing I'll say is it's not a condition that's actually recognized by Iowa law.
Got it.
So there are a couple of definitions, though, that we can rely on. So there's a definition from NAR, which is a property that has been psychologically impacted by an event which occurred or was suspected to have occurred. And generally, stigmatized properties are thought of as properties where things like deaths or murders have occurred in the home, or there's the existence of ghosts or poltergeists or other apparitions.
Yes, got it.
Like Travis Bouchaw.
That's well done. Well done.
Get that in there.
No, I figured you would want to. Okay, so let's talk through that a little bit, because one of those, pretty easy to be able to say, yes, this happened, because we maybe have police records, we have newspaper articles that, murder, death, potential suicide, those things maybe are noted in some type of, whether it's online or newspaper.
Yep.
But when it comes to the idea of a property being haunted and that being a stigmatizing condition, like how does that ever play out in courts, or what would that look like? So talk us.
So it actually played out in court in New York once back in 1991. So there's this famous case, it's called Stambovsky versus Ackley, and it's also called the Ghostbusters Case. So what happened was the court found, as a matter of law, in their opinion, this is legal opinion rendered by a judge, that the house was haunted. Now, there was a question of disclosure, because so some of the facts from the case were, this lady who owned the house told multiple newspapers that the house was haunted. It was published of record that the house was haunted.
So if you were doing some research, you'd be able to actually find out that this existed.
Yeah, she was telling people, hey, there are ghosts in the house. But when it came to disclosing to the buyer, we're not quite sure.
Right.
So the record indicates that there was a phone call from the broker that said, hey, the seller wants you to know that this house was haunted. And the buyer's like, yeah, whatever, that's fine. And then afterwards he said, well, nobody actually told me that the house was haunted. Like, it's not on paper anywhere. So she fraudulently misrepresented the condition of the house.
Got it.
Well, the court said, no, actually, it's public record. Yeah. You were notified by somebody. There was a phone call. And even though it wasn't on the seller's disclosure itself, where would you put something like that on the seller's disclosure? So you can't claim for fraudulent misrepresentation. You knew there were ghosts. You got to take the house as it is.
Interesting.
Yes.
Okay, so Iowa doesn't, like you mentioned, Iowa doesn't have anything in code that says that a stigmatizing property exists per code.
Yes.
But let's switch gears just a little on this, because I'm intrigued. So code of ethics.
Yeah.
Because we know that sometimes, even if it's not in our Iowa code per legislation, code of ethics will still hold us, again, to a higher standard, which is what it's supposed to do.
Absolutely.
Is there a piece of potentially code of ethics that says, when it comes to making sure that we're being honest to the public, that if we as agents have been told by the seller, or we know this, do we have a duty to disclose? And obviously it's going to come down to, if our seller wants us to disclose, easy.
Yeah.
Right? I had a client once, a buyer client, that we walked into a big old 2-story, and she's like, is it haunted? I'm like, I don't know. Right. I'm like, the seller hasn't told me so I'm guessing no, and they were disappointed. They're like, we're really looking for a haunted house. I'm like, I don't know how to find that for you. But if I had known, and whether seller was disclosing or not, or it's let's pretend it's an estate, and I'd been told by family that property's haunted, or that somebody had passed away there. Do I have a obligation per code of ethics that somebody, that there was a criminal activity or something like that, or someone had just passed in the house? Do I have to disclose that to potential buyers and buyers agents?
I would probably direct you to Articles 1, 2, and 12. Okay. So Article 1, dealing with honesty. You have to treat all parties honestly. Article 2, dealing with disclosure of pertinent facts. And granted, that becomes a judgment call of, is it a pertinent fact, right? And then Article 12, about being honest in your real estate advertisements. So yeah, probably. And then granted, again, it becomes like a judgment call. And it is, of course, the easier case when the seller says, yeah, definitely, let them know. But you also, as a realtor, don't want to find yourself in a situation where the client says yes, and you're like, whoa, wait a minute, should we? Because if the client's giving you permission to disclose the thing, just go ahead and disclose the thing.
Yeah. So the opposite is if you have a client that doesn't want to, or the client that says, hey, it's it's a POA or it's an estate, and they say, hey, mom did pass away here.
Yeah.
Like the piece of, well, we don't have a disclosure and we don't have anything on our disclosure anyway that this would be requiring it. So that is where it gets interesting. The other one that we've talked about a lot in just law update classes is kind of the need when there's other criminal activities. So not murder, death, suicide, not ghosts, but I know those are the fun ones. But maybe we had, we've talked about this, methamphetamine manufacturing. Well, that's an obvious because that number one would probably show up in the papers, but two, there had to be some very necessary precautions.
Absolutely.
The one that we kind of talk about more is it's a grow room in the basement, or they were arrested because they had a certain amount of illegal drugs in the home, but weren't manufacturing there. And they're like, well, you could find in the newspaper that somebody was arrested here, but does it affect the property? Is it affecting the value? And that's an interesting one there. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so that becomes, unfortunately, a much trickier situation, right? Because on the one hand, you have likely received information of some form of activity that is probably criminal in nature. But also, it's not the type of activity that's going to necessarily affect like the structural integrity of the home or the condition of the home. So what do you do? And honestly, I don't think there's a duty to disclose in many of those situations. I think the facts are going to make a difference if it's something that, involves some sort of like usage of chemicals, right? Are you down there spraying fertilizer or some sort of dangerous chemical that could have residual effects?
For sure.
Well, if you know about that, you probably do have to disclose it. On the other hand, if it's an all-natural grow operation, so to speak, you might have a little more leeway in terms of what you have to talk about.
Good. Interesting stuff. And again, it's nearing Halloween. It comes up in a lot of discussions, but with the Iowa not requiring it, but Code of Ethics maybe saying yes, it is required. It's always an interesting conversation as we work through those. So Justin, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
The last thing I would say is just also remember your disclosure obligations under the law as well. So while you don't have an obligation to disclose stigmatized properties, you do have an obligation to disclose like materially adverse facts, right? So it's not just the Code of Ethics, it is also the law.
If something that's going to negatively affect that value, make sure we're disclosing.
Comply with both.
Awesome. Thank you, Justin.